There are some words that are so important to the Christian faith that if anybody, in any sense, tries to mess around with them, they can find themselves in a lot of trouble. And one of those words is the word gospel. And I understand that because there is only one gospel by which an unsaved person can hear who Jesus Christ is and what he did, and by believing that, be saved. Paul articulates that for us in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 4. But, having said that, there are other messages that are preached in the New Testament. Jesus Christ himself did this. He had his disciples do this. And Paul himself does this. That also are classified as gospels, but they're not gospels for the unsaved. They are gospels for believers. They're gospels that tell us now good news of what God is doing for us right now. And I believe this is what Paul is referring to here when he's saying in Romans 16:25, to him who is able to establish you according to my gospel. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and we're looking at how God establishes or makes believers stable. And that stability stands by the standard of Paul's gospel. This gospel, Paul says, it's my gospel, a gospel that had been committed to him. And if we go over to Galatians, we can see this again being laid out in a problem, because he says in Galatians 1:6, I'm amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel. Now, they're not going back and trying to come up with a different way to evangelize unsaved people. What Paul is talking about is now somebody else has come along and told these Galatian Christians that Paul did not tell them everything they needed to know about how to live, because they should be getting circumcised and keeping the law. This issue comes up more than once in the New Testament. He says, and that really is not, he said, well, it's a different gospel, heteros. So he says it's a different kind of gospel, which is not another. It's not similar. Only there are some, verse 7, who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel concerning the Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach or evangelize to you a gospel or a good news that is contrary to what we have preached or given you as this good news, let him be accursed. In this word, very interesting, as you go through this in the New Testament, you find it means to be set aside. In fact, you have a group of men in the book of Acts that they put themselves under a curse that they're not going to drink or eat anything until they capture Paul and see that he's put to death. Never happens. So I always wonder what happened to that. And they're not being accursed, asked to go to hell or anything like that. They are setting themselves aside from something that is a normal way of life, such as eating and drinking, until this is done. So this accursed means to be set on the bench. And the reason for that is Paul's saying, if somebody comes along and is trying to tell you that you should be living the Christian life differently than you are, namely that you should be living the Christian life by keeping the law, he says, let that person be put on the bench, because they're not teaching the Christian life properly. And if you read the book of Galatians is really does not really deal with how people come to initial salvation, what we call saving faith in Christ. It's about how Christians are to live. In fact, interestingly enough, in Galatians 2, Paul goes down, he says after 14 years, after all of this has transpired, Paul says in verse 2, it was because of revelation that he goes up to Jerusalem, and I submitted or set before them, interestingly enough, it's a form of our word to be a curse. It's related to that, but it has to do with I set it out there before them, submitted to them, the gospel, he says, which I preached, which I heralded, gave as a good news among the Gentiles. And I did so in private to those who were of reputation, for fear that I might be running or had run in vain. Is Paul saying, I don't know if I'm telling people how to get saved right? No. Paul's saying, I wanted to make sure that these people understood The message, this good news, I was telling Gentiles about how they live. Because Paul had not been teaching Gentiles to live by law. Paul had been teaching them to live by who they are in Christ, to live by a ministry or work of the Spirit. Now, this is interesting because when you go to the book of Acts, we might think that the minute the church started, that, hey, well, Christ died on the cross, and so everybody's done with the law, but they're still keeping the law as late as Acts 21. And Acts 21 is probably around 67 AD. Stop and think about that. That's 37 years after Christ died, rose, and ascended to heaven, and the church started. And they're still keeping the law. They're still going to the temple. Not only just going to the temple, but they're engaged in sacrificial rites. They actually have Paul put up money so that some men that have a Jewish vow on their heads, can actually offer the sacrifices necessary. And if you go back to Leviticus, one of the sacrifices they offered to end that vow was a sin offering. Because the offerings at the temple were never about how a person was saved. They had to do with how a person was relating to God at the temple. That's what it was about. And that was true for a believing or unbelieving Israeli in the Old Testament. It had to do how they approached God. And so when Paul's talking about this here in Galatians 2, he's talking about a good news for the Gentiles, a good news that, interestingly enough, in Acts 15, as Paul lays that out, Peter goes, you know what? And we Jews also will be saved like this. In other words, he recognizes eventually the law is going to be done, and even the Jewish believers are going to have to live by this relationship to who Christ is for us as believers right now. In fact, in the last one here in Galatians chapter 3, again, as I said, Galatians is about Christian living. And so Paul says this in Galatians 3:2, this is the only thing I want to find out from you. Did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or hearing of faith? And they were going, well, by faith. They all know that. So now he wants to ask them the question. Are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected or matured by the flesh? And that's the issue in Romans. Is about these believers becoming stable, an aspect of maturity. And the issue is if you're going to live by law, Galatians, you're going to live by the flesh. If you want to live by faith, then you can actually go back to living by the Spirit, which is the way you started. See, the issue in Galatians is not about how do we tell unsaved people to get saved. It's about now that you are saved, are we matured by the flesh? And are we matured by keeping the law? Is that how this works? Is that how this is accomplished? Because that's what people were telling them. And I'm using this to try to demonstrate that there are things that are these gospels that Paul announced. And I believe this gospel that Paul's referring to here in Galatians 16:25 is the same gospel that he's making reference to in Galatians, that it's talking about this is who you, as this is a good news, this is who you are now as a believer in Christ, which connects directly to the next phrase, the preaching or the proclamation concerning Jesus Christ, who he is. And your Christian life rests on your understanding who you are in Christ. If you don't understand who you are in Christ, you can never live the Christian life the way God has intended you to live the Christian life. And as a result, you will lack stability. Because chances are you're going to turn to law as a Christian, as a way of Christian living, not as a way of, as an unsaved person, becoming saved. And it's when you are relating to who God says you are in Christ, which is what these studies have been going all the way back to March of 2020 when I started in these studies. These studies have been trying to help you as a believer appreciate who you are in Christ and how God ties that to the way you live your Christian life. Because it's only as you're doing that that you can have a good day in Christ. Thank you for joining me today.